Well, it's a privilege to be here this morning and to look together with you at this passage. You know, today we find ourselves here in Portland, Oregon, in one of the larger cities in the U.S. And the question today, as you go about your life in an urban setting, how can you be an effective witness for Christ? How do you deal with the frustration of people who have heard the good news, but they've rejected it? How and where do you spend the limited hours of each day in a way that lets others know and see the difference that Jesus makes in a life? And how do you treat those who are against you at work or at school or in your neighborhood? You know, the Bible passage we're looking at today is full of many names, several different storylines, so I'll only focus on a few, but it's important to point out that a lot of Bible passages are prescriptive. That is, that God clearly prescribes or instructs us something specific to do. But this passage is descriptive. It describes something that happened to the early church. This means we're given some freedom to interpret the facts of what happened and then use our God-given creativity to draw some conclusions and implications for our lives today. So, in Acts 18, verse 1, the Apostle Paul and his friends have arrived in the city of Corinth. And you might remember, as we've been going through Luke and Acts this year, which has been a wonderful series, we are here in the mission section, chapters 16 through 23. So just a reminder that it's around 50 AD, which means it's only been about 20 years since Jesus left the earth. And as we read about Paul's ministry in Acts and throughout the New Testament, it's clear that he deliberately moved from one strategic city to the next, with good news about Jesus and what he's done. So think about last week, we talked briefly about Thessalonica. Ephesus is mentioned, Athens, Corinth. These are some of the bigger cities in the region. And now he's in Corinth, which is perhaps the biggest city in Greece at the time. So let me paint the picture for you. Corinth has been compared to Las Vegas, or perhaps New Orleans during Mardi Gras. It's a wealthy city, largely due to having two ports where goods were being unloaded from ships. A lot of the population were maritime merchants. In Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea, whom Romans called Neptune, he was worshipped. It was home for a lot of different cultures, a lot of different ethnicities. In fact, today's passage includes citizens from Greece, Italy, Spain, and other places. So it was known as this commercial center with world-famous shopping. The author F.W. Farrar imagines that the markets were stocked with goods like, quote, Arabian balsam, Egyptian papyrus, Phoenician dates and fruits, Libyan ivory, Babylonian carpets, and much more. In fact, years later, Paul writes something interesting. In 1 Corinthians 2, 1 through 3, he writes about how he felt when he first arrived in Corinth. He says, quote, "When I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And I came to you in weakness and with great fear and trembling." So what was it about Corinth that caused this man who's known for his courage to be fearful and trembling and to focus his teaching on Jesus and the cross? Well, it's likely that the wealth of the city produced great pride and immorality that are detailed somewhat in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. In fact, British Christian author John Stott says that they were proud of their city, they boasted of its wealth and culture, of the famous mini Olympics, which was called the Isthmian Games, that it hosted every other year, and proud of its political prestige as the capital of the province. And behind the city, nearly 2,000 feet above sea level, there was this hill called the Acrocorinth, and on its flat summit was the temple of Aphrodite, or Venus, the goddess of love, and 1,000 female slaves served her and then roamed the city streets by night as prostitutes. So what does Paul do in the midst of this urban, highly secular, even anti-Christian setting? Where does he begin witnessing? Where does he decide to start? Well, the first few verses seem to indicate that Paul did not simply stand on the corner and preach. He didn't fill a coliseum with people and explain the gospel to them with a 3-point sermon. Instead, he worked at a small business. He dealt with customers and shoppers every day. So we read in verse 3 that he was a tent maker, which many historians interpret as a leather worker. Think about it. Leatherworking tools would be easy for him to transport as he traveled from city to city. Leather was normally used for making tents, but also for sails of ships and other leather items like awnings for shops or booths for those biennial mini Olympics. In this Greek port city with tons of commerce, he forms this business partnership with Aquila and Priscilla, a married couple who had recently arrived from Rome, Italy, after facing religious discrimination. And so together they established this small business. Another commentator says that the shop, if you can picture it, the shop would have oil and blacking, it would have knives, it would have awls, it would have sharpening stones, it would have a table and a stool or a few stools, some benches for customers. It would not require the actual tanning and treating of hides. Actually, leather workers, they focused on learning how to cut and sew leather for durability. So Paul could share Christ at work. People often conversed in shops. Unlike metalsmiths, this commentator says, leather workers had a fairly quiet work that allowed simultaneous conversation, including discussion of important ideas. So as he settles into the business partnership and life in the big city, he begins to build relationships. He follows a pattern that we've seen before in Acts, where he visits the local synagogue regularly. In verse 4, it talks about him going to reason with other attendees about the good news of Jesus Christ. You know, as Pastor Pete pointed out last week, the word reason, which was in the passage he preached on, that word reason has a root meaning that indicates there was a dialogue. Paul wasn't just declaring truths or preaching, he was interacting with people over what they believed, their struggles to believe in Jesus. John Stott, the author I mentioned earlier, has this quote that we'll put on the screen, that when we contrast much contemporary evangelism with Paul, the shallowness is immediately revealed. Our evangelism tends to be focused on simply inviting people to church. Paul also took the gospel out into the secular world. Our evangelism appeals to the emotions for decision without adequate basis for understanding. Paul taught, reasoned, and tried to persuade. Our evangelism is superficial, making brief encounters, expecting quick results. Paul stayed in Corinth, faithfully sowing gospel seed, and in due time, reaping a harvest. Well, an unexpected gift or some kind of support arrives in verse 5. It indicates that now he can pause his work and he can focus 100% on talking to people about Jesus. However, that increased time and energy that's spent witnessing does not produce results. You know, if an apostle or an evangelist like Paul spends more time talking about Jesus, aren't we guaranteed that there will be more results? You'd think so, but not necessarily. Instead of people deciding to follow Jesus, the Jews he was dialoguing with became more and more opposed to him. So then in verse 6, we see that he, quote, shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be upon your own heads. I'm clear of my responsibility, and from now on I will go to the Gentiles." In Luke 9:5, you don't need to look it up, but Jesus instructed his disciples to do something similar. He said that if those disciples were rejected, Jesus said they should shake off the, quote, dust of their feet and leave a place where the message of Jesus was being rejected. So we know from Acts 13:51 that Paul had already done something similar, and now he's taking this symbolic action in a culture where rituals held power. You know, I've had the privilege of visiting the Middle East. It reminds me a little bit of Eastern Oregon. lots of dry earth, lots of dust that can infiltrate everything. In Middle Eastern culture, shaking the dust off the feet or shaking it out of their clothes is a way to show that a messenger is absolving himself or herself of any guilt and leaving a little bit more dust on the community that won't become pure by following the message. So according to one theologian, shaking out one's garments might serve as a warning of judgment to covenant breakers, even more dramatically than shaking dust from one's feet. You know, in 1997, I was walking the streets of Damascus, Syria. Damascus is one of the oldest inhabited cities in the world. It's a city full of beautiful, narrow streets, small shops, ornate mosques, beautiful public squares. And I remember as the sun was going down, it was a red sunset, and I was walking with one of the missionaries, and we entered into their house and sat down, and the next thing I heard shocked me. This missionary said that after being in a certain suburb for many years and witnessing that he and his team had decided to move to a different neighborhood soon, they were going to stop trying to reach these people with the gospel in that suburb, in that neighborhood. He said they were being biblical by shaking the dust off their feet. Now, I don't know about you, but I was raised with a lot of stories of endurance, persistence, perseverance by missionaries, praying for years, continuing to testify. So it rocked my world because it appeared that they were giving up. They were giving up on people and dooming them to a life without the hope and the love that Jesus brings. But since then, I've reflected on this a lot. You know, there are examples in scriptures about persisting, and I've certainly even heard stories about people recently who have felt led to continue their witness to unbelievers for many, many years until they finally decided to follow Jesus. But it's important to acknowledge that there are examples like this when it's okay to stop trying to reach someone who's had access to the gospel, fair chance to respond, but has instead decided to oppose the message and even become abusive. And it does make sense if you think about it. God designed the world with only 24 hours a day. We only have one life to live. So am I giving you permission right now to stop witnessing to that coworker or neighbor or relative who's becoming nasty? Well, first it's important to note that although Paul shifts his ministry from this group of the Jews to the Gentiles, it's not really about an individual, it's about this group. And the shift isn't forever. His pronouncement is more of a local judgment. In other cities later in life, as we read throughout the New Testament, Paul does try to reach Jews in other places. So he didn't reject this group of people forever, rather a group of people in a specific time and place, and he was very clear in his own mind and his own spiritual discernment that he had fulfilled his responsibility to clearly explain the gospel to this particular group of people. He wasn't being lazy, he wasn't being shy or simply giving up, but he was intentionally shifting that effort towards another group of people. Well, fortunately, God provides a businessman who opens up his home so that Paul can establish a house church. We don't know much about the house owner, Titius Justus, who's mentioned here, but he was clearly a non-Jew. That's signified by this descriptive phrase, he was a worshiper of God, in verse 7. And Titius decided to follow Jesus at some point. He happened to live near the synagogue where the Jews were meeting that had rejected Paul. You know, I had a chance to visit Ephesus, and it's another city that had a lot of house churches around this same time in history. And I remember walking down the street and looking on the hillside, and there's these homes that are slightly larger, owned by middle-class, upper-class business people. And these larger houses allow for about 20 to 40 people to gather together for worship, and they often met in an open courtyard in the middle of that home, and it was centered around a fountain or a pool. It's just beautiful. You know, as an aside, part of my job here at Village, part of my role on staff, is to be a steward of the 13 acres, over 102,000 square feet of indoor space that God's given us. You know, many church members who have gone before us have invested in this place, many of you, and we can enjoy these facilities that we have. You know, I'm really, truly grateful for the heritage. The investment allows us to do ministry on this campus, as well as use the space to equip people to go out into their neighborhoods and do ministry. We collaborate with other churches to host conferences or ministries. I'm thinking of the Bible Study Fellowship, which meets here. There's a men's group, a women's group from many, many churches across Beaverton. And at the same time, it's important to note that the form of church we consider normal, which is a big building or buildings that we own, we can use it whenever we want, is not the only way of doing church. In fact, I've heard it argued that it's only been for a small portion of the total of history, like the last few hundred years, that the majority of Christians have decided around the world to do church this way. So today's passage is a good reminder that the church is defined as people who are following Jesus and doing life together. And those people, the church, can meet in many different places, including homes, but also schools, hotel ballrooms, even pubs. And as I'm sure you know, in many parts of the world, notably China, the majority of Christians, like millions of Christians, like right now, are meeting in homes and similar gatherings of a few dozen people. So as I was meditating on today's passage, I was convicted again that we need to hold loosely the physical things that God has given us. Because although we should be responsible, I hope we can stay here at 330 Southwest Murray for many, many more decades. The important thing is following the Holy Spirit and continuing to meet together regularly. Well, verses 8 through 11, there's good news. Paul begins to see Greeks and other non-Jews deciding to follow Jesus. There's also a few Jews, including the head of the synagogue, that had rejected him. So verse 8 says that Crispus, quote, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard him, Paul, they also believed and they were baptized. I just want to pause. You know, here and in many other places throughout the Bible, it says that somebody, quote, and their entire household decided to follow Jesus. Often we read Scripture through Western eyes, which is all about making an individual decision to follow Jesus, invite him into my heart, control my life. But there is nothing wrong with someone deciding on behalf of a whole household or a community or a tribe that they will change their beliefs together and then learn what behaviors change, what it looks like to follow Jesus. You know, of course, as people get to know more about following Jesus, they do need to establish a personal relationship with him. But, you know, in my culture, I have the opposite challenge. I start with, individually believing in Jesus, and then I have to learn to find some group or a community that will walk together with me to live that out. Well, next, Jesus speaks in a beautiful dream to Paul in verses 9 through 10. Do not be afraid, keep on speaking, do not be silent, says Jesus in the dream. For I am with you. No one is going to attack you and harm you, because I have many people in this city. You know, several times in the last year, if you've been listening, Pastor Paul Choi has encouraged us to reframe our thinking, because often we think about bringing Jesus into our workplace or into our school or into our neighborhood. You know, when I used to work with Microsoft or at Nike, I'd occasionally worry about, how do I take the initiative at work to be a witness for Jesus? How do I have that 30-second elevator speech ready to go? I'm literally in the elevator with somebody, 30 seconds to witness about Jesus. But what if God's already there? What if he is already at work? What if he cares more for those people, the people around you? What if he cares more for them than you do? And I believe that God is already at work in hearts and minds. And because of that, our goal should be to discover or identify where God is working. Instead of stressing out over how I bring God into a situation, I can listen intently for things like comments by people about deep personal values, struggles in their life that Jesus could help them with, or maybe questions they have about this messy world we live in. Jesus says here to the Apostle Paul, quote, I have many people in the city, and it's implied that Paul's goal is now to go find them, to see where God is already working. One commentator says this, and we'll have it on the screen for you, that like Peter in Caesarea, that Paul finds that God is already at work in this confusing pagan city. There's no territory outside the purview of the living God. So there's a sense of relief about the verb stayed in verse 11. 18 months is longer than Paul stayed almost anywhere. It enables him to do real foundational work in Corinth, teaching the word and building up the church. So what do we do with today's snapshots of a few moments in the church's early history? As I mentioned earlier, today's scriptures are descriptive, not necessarily prescriptive. Other parts of the Bible contain those direct commands or prescriptions on what we should do, but this portion observes the facts of what happened, and it leaves us free to draw some conclusions. So here's some ideas. First, witnessing is not primarily about preaching or presenting our case for why Jesus is the truth and the life, but about intentionally doing life alongside people. It's about natural relationships. It's, think about it, again, just as Paul used his leatherworking skills to establish relationships with customers, he regularly visits the synagogue to start a dialogue. Who is God bringing into your life that you could show an interest in? We're in an urban setting like Paul was in Corinth, so simply start where you're at. As a student, in the workplace, in your neighborhood, think who is coming to your workplace and open to a friendship with you, who has moved into your neighborhood recently. And this is so vital that when you do have opportunities to talk about your faith, are you preaching to people or truly dialoguing with them to see what has formed their values and beliefs? Are you listening to where God is already working in their lives? And second, do you remember how Paul dealt with his frustration over people who had the chance to clearly hear the gospel and had rejected it? As I said before, we need to be a little careful not to apply this to every situation, since sometimes we do need to be persistent in our witness. However, if God is at work in the Portland metro area, if God is at work in the world, and we have limited time and energy, it is okay sometimes to shake the dust out of our clothes and move on to another group of people who are more open to the gospel. It's not a sin to shift your attention to another group of people. So think, who is interested in eternal things around you? Who is rethinking their values? Or as you read the news, which communities in Portland seem open to discussing spiritual things and spiritual needs? On a global level, I want to take just a moment to remind you that, unfortunately, 97% of missionaries are sent to people who already have access to the gospel. According to a comprehensive study that the entire staff was sent, it's like 300 pages, so I don't think all of them have read it. But according to this study that came out a few weeks ago from the Lausanne movement, it's called The State of the Great Commission, the vast majority of missionaries go to predominantly Christian or post-Christian communities where interest in Jesus isn't usually very high. Should we shake the dust off? It does seem to lead to a massive lack of connection to other people who follow other religions and are often seeking the peace that only Jesus can bring. Out of approximately 7 billion people in the world today, about 3 billion are considered unreached by missiologists. The word unreached has a simple but practical and precise definition. Unreached is groups of people who do not have an indigenous church that's capable of evangelizing their own people. So I guess the question is, where do you put your time and your money? Where do you focus your prayers? What would happen if you and I shift our efforts towards ministries? And Village has traditionally done this. Ministries which historically focus on unreached people. Both people who have come to our city as immigrants or refugees, as well as those who are living overseas in places like Lebanon, North Korea, or even India. So I want to ask you to pray specifically for the next 6 days for a historic meeting that starts today, goes through next Saturday, September 28th. Bible-believing, evangelical, missional Christians from around the world gather about once in 10 years. And they make plans and strategies to fulfill this mission statement for this organization that's called the Lausanne Movement. The mission statement is the gospel for every person, disciple-making churches for every people and place, Christ-like leaders for every church and sector of society, and kingdom impact in every sphere of society. So this gathering produces joint statements by Christians from across many denominations. They're from every part of the globe. And at Village, over the last few years, our church's leaders have actually used these statements to inform our doctrine so that we don't get too biased and just only have a Western perspective. In fact, both pastors, John Jordan and Paul Choi, are there today with one of our council members, Karen Fancher. So let's pray that the global body of Christ will make clear-headed decisions on where and how to shake the dust, if needed, out of their clothes in order to reach people who have no access to the gospel and haven't had a chance to respond to Jesus, even though they're open to that life-giving message of Jesus. So in conclusion, I'm going to invite you to step back, think about what it means to be missional in light of today's Bible passage. You know, in the New Testament, the main characters are heroes of the faith, like the Apostle Paul. They travel extensively to take the gospel to new people. They ensure that the new churches remain committed to Jesus and remain committed to each other in community life. And Acts shows us that wherever they lived, including big cities like Corinth, that Jesus followers, including Paul, simply started where God had put them. They engaged in relational and intentional witnessing at the workplace, at their schools, elsewhere, and they continued looking for where God was already working and active. So is this the same for us today here in Portland? We have the opportunity to reach out, to dialogue, and to befriend across boundaries for the sake of the gospel.